It was already late when the officer noticed the child standing alone near the side of the road. There were cars passing, streetlights flickering, and shops closing for the night, yet the boy remained in the same place, unmoving, as if he was waiting for something he couldn't explain. He wasn't crying loudly or calling for help. His eyes were fixed on the ground, his small hands gripping the straps of a worn backpack. The officer approached slowly, careful not to scare him, and spoke in a calm, steady voice. The child looked up, confused, unsure whether this adult was safe or just another person who would walk away. When asked his name, the boy hesitated before answering, his voice barely audible. He couldn't say where his home was. He didn't know any phone numbers. He only knew that he had been walking and suddenly realized he didn't recognize anything around him anymore. The officer didn't rush him, didn't pressure him, and didn't treat him like a problem that needed to be solved quickly. Instead, he stayed there, listening, observing, understanding that the child's silence said more than his words. The night air grew colder, and the officer noticed the boy shivering slightly. Without making a big deal of it, he removed his own jacket and gently placed it around the child's shoulders. The boy didn't resist. He accepted it quietly, as if kindness was something unfamiliar but not unwanted. Sitting nearby, the officer asked simple questions, not to interrogate, but to connect. What he learned was limited: school name, a favorite food, long hours spent alone, but each answer painted a clearer picture. This wasn't just a child who had taken a wrong turn. This was a child who had learned to manage on his own far too early. Time passed, and no one came looking. No frantic calls. No worried parents. The officer contacted the necessary departments, but even as procedures began, he stayed close, keeping the boy within sight, making sure he wasn't treated like a forgotten object. The child eventually leaned against him, exhaustion taking over, trusting this stranger in uniform more than the empty night around them. In that moment, the officer understood that this encounter was no longer about finding directions or filling out a report. It was about responsibility. About choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier. About recognizing that sometimes the most important thing you can give a lost child isn't answers, but presence. It was hours after the officer first stopped for the child, yet nothing about the situation felt resolved. The streets had grown quieter, the kind of silence that makes everything feel heavier, and still no one had come forward asking about a missing boy. The officer remained with him, not out of obligation, but because leaving felt wrong. Procedures moved forward in the background, calls were made, names were checked, and systems were searched, but the results kept coming back empty. The child sat nearby, small and withdrawn, watching everything with cautious eyes, as if expecting at any moment to be told to move along. The officer noticed how the boy flinched at sudden sounds, how he stayed alert even when tired, how he never fully relaxed. These were not habits formed in a single night. They were learned. When asked again about home, the boy gave answers that circled back on themselves, directions that didn't lead anywhere, descriptions that sounded more like routine than belonging. He spoke about waiting, about doors staying closed, about learning how to make food by himself, about sleeping while listening for footsteps that sometimes never came. The officer listened without reacting, understanding that showing shock would only make the child pull back. Time stretched, and eventually the boy's energy faded. His words slowed, his eyes grew heavy, but he fought sleep as if rest was something unsafe. When he finally gave in, it was only because the officer stayed within reach, close enough to make the space feel less uncertain. Throughout the night, the officer remained alert, watching over him, thinking about how easily this moment could have been missed, how many people must have walked past the same child without stopping. As morning approached, the boy woke and looked around in panic, not recognizing where he was, until his eyes found the officer. Only then did his breathing settle. That reaction said more than any report ever could. When the boy began talking again, his words came more freely, not because he trusted the system, but because he trusted the person in front of him. He spoke about being afraid of going back, about not wanting to disappear again, about how getting lost felt no different from being invisible at home. The officer didn't offer comfort in the form of promises. He offered honesty, consistency, and attention. He explained what would happen next in simple terms, never talking over the child, never treating him like someone too young to understand. When social services became involved, the officer stayed present, making sure the boy's voice wasn't lost among forms and decisions. He asked questions on the child's behalf, slowed things down when they moved too fast, and made it clear that this wasn't just another routine case. Even when his shift ended, he stayed, choosing to remain until he was certain the child would not be handed off without care. By the time arrangements were made, the boy no longer looked like someone waiting to be forgotten. He looked tired, uncertain, but no longer alone. The officer understood then that while the night had started with a lost child, it had become something else entirely. It had become a turning point. Not marked by sirens or urgency, but by quiet decisions, patience, and the choice to see one child not as a problem to solve, but as a life that deserved protection. As the days passed after that night, the case did not simply close and disappear into paperwork, and neither did the officer's involvement. While the child was placed under temporary care and routines began to form around him, the officer continued to follow the progress quietly, without drawing attention to himself. He checked reports, asked for updates, and made sure timelines were not rushed for the sake of convenience. The child, now in a safer environment, showed signs of adjustment, but also signs of confusion, as if stability itself felt unfamiliar. He asked fewer questions, not because he understood everything, but because he had learned that asking often led nowhere. When the officer visited, the child's behavior shifted. He spoke more. He made eye contact. He showed small details from his day that might have seemed insignificant to anyone else. These moments confirmed what the officer already suspected: consistency mattered more than reassurance. Over time, information about the child's past became clearer, and it painted a picture of long-term neglect rather than a single mistake. Decisions had to be made carefully, and the officer made sure his observations were recorded accurately, not exaggerated, not softened, just truthful. There were discussions, evaluations, and steps that moved slowly, sometimes frustratingly so, but the officer understood that permanence required caution. Throughout this process, the child remained guarded, as if expecting the attention to fade. He tested boundaries, withdrew at times, and watched closely for signs of abandonment. The officer did not attempt to replace anyone or step outside his role. But he did something equally important. He remained reliable. When he said he would return, he did. When he said he would check on something, he followed through. These actions, repeated over time, began to change how the child responded to the world. Trust didn't appear suddenly. It formed gradually, in small increments, built on predictability rather than emotion. Months passed, and the child's life took a different direction, one that included structure, supervision, and care. When the transition became more permanent, the officer ensured the handover was done with clarity, not distance. He explained changes to the child honestly, acknowledging uncertainty without creating fear. The boy listened quietly, no longer shrinking inward, no longer bracing himself for disappointment. Years later, long after the case files had been archived, the impact of those early choices became clear. The officer encountered the young man again, no longer lost, no longer invisible, but grounded. The recognition between them required no explanation. It was understood. The officer realized then that the true significance of that night had never been about intervention alone. It had been about presence, patience, and the decision to treat one lost child as someone whose future mattered. Not because policy demanded it, but because choosing to stay had changed the direction of a life. Time continued to move forward, and life returned to its usual rhythm, but the effects of that encounter remained. The officer returned to routine patrols, paperwork, and calls that blended together, yet certain moments stayed clear in his memory. He found himself paying closer attention to details he might once have overlooked: the quiet pauses, the hesitation in a voice, the way some people stood as if unsure whether they were allowed to take up space. The child's case had ended officially, but its influence did not. It had altered how the officer understood his role, not as someone who simply responded to situations, but as someone whose choices within those moments could have lasting consequences. The child, now growing into a different stage of life, carried forward the impact of being seen and protected at a time when he had expected to be ignored. He did not remember every word spoken or every step taken, but he remembered the consistency, the calm presence, and the fact that someone had stayed when they could have walked away. There was no dramatic conclusion, no public recognition, and no moment where everything suddenly felt resolved. Instead, there was continuity. The quiet understanding that a single decision, repeated through small actions, had shifted a life onto a safer path. The officer never claimed credit, and the child never framed the experience as rescue. It existed simply as a turning point, one defined not by urgency or force, but by attention and responsibility. In time, both moved forward independently, connected only by a shared memory that no longer needed explanation. The meaning of that night did not fade, but it did settle into something steady and permanent, a reminder that even in ordinary circumstances, choosing to notice and remain present can change outcomes in ways that are never immediately visible, but deeply enduring. Years passed without ceremony, and the world continued to move forward in the way it always does, indifferent to the quiet moments that shape individual lives. The officer remained in service, responding to calls, filling out reports, and moving through days that blended together, yet his approach had subtly changed. He listened more closely, waited a little longer, and recognized hesitation where others might see compliance or silence. That single encounter with a lost child had recalibrated his sense of duty, not by adding new rules, but by reinforcing the importance of judgment, patience, and accountability. He understood that authority did not come only from a uniform, but from the choices made when no one was watching and no recognition was expected. The child, now older, carried forward a memory that had become part of his foundation, even if he did not always articulate it. He grew up with the understanding that stability could exist, that care could be consistent, and that being noticed did not always lead to harm. The moment of being found had replaced an earlier belief that disappearing was normal. Over time, this shift influenced how he interacted with others, how he trusted, and how he imagined his future. There was no single moment where everything changed, no sudden transformation, but rather a gradual realignment built on the knowledge that his life had been acknowledged at a critical point. The paths of the officer and the child did not cross often after that, and when they did, the interactions were brief and understated. There was no need for explanation or reflection in words. The significance existed without being spoken. Each understood, in their own way, that what had occurred was not extraordinary in appearance, but profound in impact. The officer never considered himself responsible for the outcome, yet he recognized that absence would have produced a different result. The child did not view himself as someone who had been saved, but as someone who had been given time, safety, and the opportunity to grow without constant uncertainty. As life continued, the memory of that night remained steady, not as a dramatic story, but as a reference point. It served as quiet proof that small, deliberate actions can alter the direction of a life without drawing attention to themselves. In the end, nothing about the story relied on spectacle, emotion, or coincidence. It rested entirely on presence, restraint, and the decision to remain engaged when disengagement would have been easier. The officer and the child moved forward separately, shaped by the same moment in different ways, carrying with them an understanding that sometimes the most meaningful change begins not with intervention or instruction, but with the simple act of staying, noticing, and accepting responsibility for another human being when they need it most.